As they're entering the cabman's shelter, they're hearing in the distance these Italians who are talking pretty loudly in Italian. Stephen understands Italian, but Bloom doesn't. He just hears the language and he says, "Ah, what a beautiful language. Maybe you could write poetry or maybe do something singing related to Italian." He's kind of remembering that his wife sings in Italian sometimes. But as he suggests this, rather than agree or disagree or try and go along with the idea, Stephen just says, "Oh, they were arguing about money. It's just a petty quarrel and it's stupid." And so once again, Stephen is going to be throwing water on whatever Bloom has to say. And as they enter the cabman's shelter, the maybe not guy that runs it, Skin the Goat, I think I've decided that whenever there's an opportunity for clarity, Joyce is going to avoid it. He would much rather leave you in doubt. If you need another example, inside this cabman's shelter, there's a lot of men, but one guy in particular is quite an interesting character. He says he's a sailor. We don't know exactly who he is, but he says his name is W.B. Murphy, and he says he's been sailing for, years and years away from home, and that he's finally come back to see his wife. But he also kind of sings at one point. He says, "For England, home and beauty." This may perhaps strike a chord with you. Do you remember in Wandering Rocks there was a one-legged sailor that was, as he walked by the Bloom house at 7 Eccles Street, he sang that exact line, "For England, home and beauty." Perhaps it's just a common sailor song to sing. But I think Joyce surely must have known this would set off some kind of flags in our head that maybe this is the same sailor. So I think the key thing to be looking out for is, does he have one leg? And we're going to look at that more in a bit. So this salty sailor, W.B. Murphy, he seems to have had a few drinks, like Stephen, and he seems to be enjoying the attention as he tells about his many journeys across the world. He's been to South America and China, you name it. He says he's been everywhere. But almost pretty quickly, when he sees Bloom and Stephen, he asks Stephen's name, and Stephen says Daedalus, and rather than admit that he's the son of Simon Daedalus, he just says, Stephen says, "Oh yeah, I've heard of Simon Daedalus." He doesn't say that he's his son. But the sailor, W.B. Murphy, he says, "Oh, Simon Daedalus, you know what? I once saw him in Stockholm, Sweden, at a circus where Simon Daedalus was working, shoot over his shoulder." I don't know if he was looking over his shoulder, but he shot 2 eggs at 50 yards and he broke them. He was that good a shot. So now if you've read A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, you probably don't remember anything that would suggest that Simon Daedalus was in a traveling circus in Europe anywhere and shooting at a distance. So I think this may be Joyce's way of telling us pretty quickly that this guy's stories, everything that he has to say, is very questionable. Very questionable. As W.B. Murphy talks more, he says that he came in that morning on the 3-master ship, that Rosevine that we've heard mentioned many times throughout the book, and that he's been away 7 years. And the thing is, we've seen that ship throughout the book by name, but also the first reference that I think we see is back in Proteus, the very last sentence of that chapter. Talking about Stephen, it says, "He turned his face over a shoulder, rear regardant, moving through the air, high spars of a 3-master, her sails brailed up on the cross trees, homing, upstream, silently moving, a silent ship." Murphy, the sailor, says he was discharged that day, so he's done his work and he's free to go home or wherever. And he shows them this slip of paper, this discharge paper. And if it was a discharge given that day, you'd think it'd be like a new paper, but it looks kind of old and crusty. So once again, we have a questionable bit of information. And then Bloom is going to ask him, "Hey, in all your travels, did you ever go by the Rock of Gibraltar? What's that look like?" He's asking because that's right near where Molly grew up as a girl. She lived there until her teen years, I believe. And rather than saying, oh yeah, this is what the Rock of Gibraltar is like. This Murphy guy, he seems like hardly aware of it. He's not clear. He doesn't give Bloom any kind of definite answer. He just says like, I'm tired of all those rocks. He seems just kind of cranky. So once again, I feel like if he's a sailor who's traveled the world, pretty much any time you're passing from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, you're going to be passing the Rock of Gibraltar. You'd be aware of it somehow. But this guy doesn't even seem to hardly know it. So once again, be very suspicious. Is this guy even a sailor? Was he on the Rosevine? Some people suggest maybe he was in prison. That seems like a good possibility. He's going to have a tattoo on his chest, so maybe he got a tattoo in prison rather than sailing. Who knows? But I think you need to take his words very with a grain of salt. Perhaps this Murphy guy is sort of the opposite of Odysseus. When Odysseus comes back to Ithaca, he has been on all these adventures, so on, but he pretends to be a humble beggar. Maybe this Murphy guy is really just a homeless vagrant wandering around, and he tells these stories about having traveled all over the world and many adventures. But for all we know, maybe he's been in Dublin his whole life, and this scrap of paper and these pictures that he has, maybe these are just things he's acquired. Stephen and Bloom are going to talk quite a bit among themselves. They talk about quite a few things, including whether the existence of a supernatural God exists. So they're getting pretty philosophical right away. And Stephen, regarding that matter, says, "Oh, that," Stephen expostulated, "has been proved conclusively by several of the best-known passages in Holy Writ, apart from circumstantial evidence." Now, unfortunately, because of the text, it's difficult to gauge how much irony and how drunken Stephen is as he says this. It's quite unclear, as we saw earlier in the book when he talked about with Haynes about the matter. What does Stephen actually believe? What does Joyce actually believe? Joyce, looking back on his younger self, I'm sure, like most of us looking back on our 22-year-old selves, can be quite critical, and we could lampoon ourselves about some of the things that we say. So who knows what any of them actually believe. Bloom doesn't seem to quite concur, though, so one more divergence between the two men. Despite their many disagreements, though, on such matters, I think there still is some connection between them, and some kind of father-son connection, in the sense that Bloom, no matter what Stephen, how disagreeable he becomes, Bloom still wants to help him, and Stephen just wants to make it to sobriety in the next day somehow, and maybe a comfortable place to sleep. So they have at least some common ground. That W.B. Murphy guy is still bragging and talking, and he gets up, though, to take a break and go urinate and maybe check on this prostitute that he was eyeing. He made tracks heavily, slowly, with a dumpy sort of a gait to the door, stepped heavily down the one step there was out of the shelter, and bore due left. While he was in the act of getting his bearings, Mr. Bloom, who noticed when he stood up that he had 2 flasks of presumably ship's rum sticking, one out of each pocket for the private consumption of his burning interior, saw him produce a bottle and uncork it, or unscrew, and, applying its nozzle to his lips, take a good old delectable swig out of it with a gurgling noise. Now, I'm tempted to think that Joyce knows that he raised the possibility that this might be that same sailor from Wandering Rocks, that he knows we're going to be, as he puts it, Sherlock Holmesing the guy, trying to find any clues to reveal this. So when he gets up and stands, the thing that we want to see is, like, does he have 2 legs or not? Does he have a peg leg? That would tell us that, yeah, it's probably almost certainly the same guy, but we don't get that. All we get is that he has a heavy step. And the things that Bloom notice, these 2 flasks, and when I was reading that, I thought he was going to say 2 legs and confirm, okay, it's not the same guy, but he says 2 flasks. So Bloom's attention is kind of diverted by these bottles. So for all we know, maybe it is still the same sailor with the peg leg, and Bloom just doesn't notice. But he does have a heavy gait. Why is there this emphasis on how he walks, unless perhaps it is the sailor? And I think Joyce knows that we can't be sure, and it's just so close to knowing, but we don't know for sure. If you have read Ulysses many more times than me, or if you can think of some passage somewhere in this chapter in Wandering Rocks or anywhere in the book that would confirm or deny whether this is the same sailor, perhaps, please let me know. I'm very curious to know if there's more information in the text that I'm missing, but as far as I can tell, it is ambiguous, but I could be wrong. Let's just keep moving on. Stephen and Bloom talk about Ireland, and Bloom has his many plans for improving the country and making everybody prosper. And he points out one detail of those. He goes, if you work. Seems like a decent plan, some kind of universal basic income perhaps. But Stephen, ever argumentative, says, count me out. He seems to want no part of Ireland. He says, we can't change the country, let us change the subject. Bloom will get his hands on a copy of the Evening Telegraph. You remember that morning in Hades, he was at the funeral of Patty Dignam, and Hines was there taking down names of who was at the funeral, kind of giving a brief report. Bloom is curious, so he looks up in the funeral notices, he reads about the funeral, and it's pretty funny description because it's full of errors and just garbled text, and the description even has, for example, Stephen Dedalus there. Stephen Dedalus was not at the funeral, and instead of saying Leopold Bloom, it says L. Boom. It also refers to the mysterious Macintosh character as Macintosh, as if that is his real name. So if this is an example of how chaotic the newspaper is in general and how media in general, as it scrambles to, release copy and release information, maybe this is Joyce trying to show how garbled things become in the telling. Interesting note here in the dialogue, not the dialogue itself, but let me show you the part. There was every indication they would arrive at that, he, Bloom, said. Who? The other, whose hand, by the way, was hurt, said. Whose hand, by the way, was hurt. So that's referring to Stephen. His hand is hurt, and I love how clumsily the narration points that out, as if it's well, why is that being indicated? One idea that I've read about is that perhaps this is referring to that incident that happened between Stephen and Mulligan and Haynes at Westland Row Station. Perhaps it came to some kind of fist. Maybe Stephen tried to punch Mulligan somehow. I don't know, but something of that matter. It's possible. Talk turns to Parnell next, and Parnell we've had many references to throughout the book and in Dubliners and Portrait of the Artist and so on. He's one of the major figures that Joyce discusses, but Bloom, his opinion of Parnell as they discuss Parnell's affair, you remember he had an affair with this woman, a married woman no less, and it just destroyed Parnell's career. But it's interesting that Bloom seems to admire Parnell. He seems to see the situation with him having the affair with Kitty O'Shea as something that, Kitty O'Shea wasn't, her and her husband weren't getting along, weren't really together, so it was just a matter of a better man stepping in. He seems to sympathize with that. It's a bit ironic because he's in a sort of the situation of the man who Parnell was having the affair with the husband in the matter. I think the problem that Bloom has with the affair that Molly is carrying on is not the affair itself. He recognizes that he is not able to consummate their marriage at this point, that it's too late for them to, well, maybe it's not too late, but they've kind of agreed that Molly, for her sexual satisfaction, she's going to have to look elsewhere. So Bloom has accepted that. What I think he doesn't like is Blazes Boylan. He's been referred to as the worst man in Dublin. So it's like, of all the people, why'd you have to pick this guy? But he recognizes that it's her choice, and he's going to have to be okay with it. But it's not something he's totally comfortable with by any means. Bloom has a picture of Molly that he shows to Stephen at some point, and he asks if he considers her a Spanish type. I was thinking about why he was showing Stephen this picture. Is he trying to somehow promote Molly to Stephen? Or I don't know, but it's also interesting that the photo is 8 years old. The food and the drink in the cabmen's shelter is pretty horrible. So Bloom asked Stephen, "When did you last dine?" "At what o'clock did you dine?" he questioned of the slim form and tired though unwrinkled face. "Sometime yesterday," Stephen said. "Yesterday!" exclaimed Bloom, till he remembered it was already tomorrow, Friday. "Ah, you mean it's after 12. The day before yesterday," Stephen said, improving on himself. I look back at Telemachus, and it does seem that Stephen had some sort of breakfast there with Mulligan and Haynes, but maybe he's taking dine as a little more literally referring to dinner. He didn't have dinner that night, and maybe not lunch either, but he did have something that morning, but it has been a long time. Or maybe he's just trying to generate some sympathy from Bloom, or maybe he's completely forgotten that he's had breakfast, who knows. Either way, it's been a very long day for both of the men, and Bloom would like to offer Stephen some real food at his house, so he suggests that they head back to his house at 7 Eccles Street and get some real food that he can make. It's similar to the Odyssey. Think of it that way, as Odysseus and Telemachus teaming up to head back to the house to slay the suitors. But instead of slaying the suitors, maybe Bloom, you're going to see, is going to have a lot of these visions, fantasies about the new life that they might live together. Maybe Stephen can live at their house and give Molly Italian lessons, singing lessons, and so on, and have something more like a family again. Millie, he feels like he's kind of losing Millie, his daughter. They don't have Rudy anymore. Maybe he feels like the empty nest is kind of coming on their house. So maybe by bringing this intelligent young man back to their home, they could establish something like a family again. So they get up to go. As they leave, Stephen says, "One thing I never understood," he said, to be original on the spur of the moment. "Why they put tables upside down at night. I mean, chairs upside down on the tables in cafes." To which impromptu the never-failing Bloom replied, without a moment's hesitation, saying straight off, "To sweep the floor in the morning." For all his learning and all his wit, Stephen lacks the real-world experience that Bloom has and can instantly answer for. So Bloom and Stephen, they're going to be walking back to 7 Eccles Street, and you can tell that Stephen's still a bit dazed. Bloom's gonna, he's saying, "Lean on me, I'll take care of you." You feel like he wants to help the young man, and maybe he is tossing Stephen to Molly as some kind of person to have an affair with, to replace Blazes Boylan. Maybe that's his idea too. I don't know, but I think that for the most part, Stephen and Bloom, they realize that they, for the moment at least, can help each other, but how long will that persist? We're going to see in the next few episodes. So that wraps up Eumaeus, more or less. I think it's pretty straightforward for the most part, and it does have a few mysteries, but not at the level of some of the mysteries that we've seen. Now, the style I mentioned before of this episode is, let me talk a little more about that. There's parts in this that talk about Bloom's idea. I think we've had it throughout the book, that maybe he could write stories for newspapers or magazines, make a little extra money. He's always coming up with these little business schemes, and this is one more of them. But what I see in this episode is maybe this is if Bloom was to actually write down this episode. He even talks about it that way, as my experiences in a cabman's shelter, something like that. I think this is that style. That's what Joyce was kind of aiming for here. It's a bit like journalism too, but I see it more as fake kind of an amateur literary attempt. But that doesn't lessen some of the really beautiful and wonderful writing that is encased within this, somewhat like in Nausicaa. Even though it's written in this kind of way that is meant to be kind of dumbed down, it's still Joyce underneath it and hiding underneath it, and it still has elements that you can't totally hide, that it is still James Joyce. So I like this episode. I think it's a much softer episode after all the rambunctious energy that we've had before. And the next few episodes are also going to be similar in that there's a lot lower energy involved.